Kia ora tātou. I'm Nikki Searancke. I'm the chairperson of Nudity Q, and if you think about incorporations, you know, many of you know incorporations here. We're a fairly young incorporation. We were formed in 1988. Prior to that, my whānau were farming bits and bobs of Nudity, parts of it, mainly all the flat land and where we'd built roading. So Nudity is in from, you turn off at it to go to Anora. Those of you who like camping, if you go to camp at Anora, then you just turn left and you carry on and you get to Nudity. I really wanted to put this up so that throughout the day before we get to the workshops, you can have a look and see the story of why we went carbon farming or how we did it. And when I have been interviewed at various times about this, I've always sort of probably not wanted to dwell down too far into why we did this, because I think the land speaks for itself. And if you know anything about Nudity, it is rather inaccessible other than if you're out on a boat and you can look back onto it. For those of us who have whānau, we go fishing, crayfishing, all the rest of it. But by and large, it's hidden from the public because the state highway doesn't run through it. But in actual fact, the state highway used to, this is the old coach road, used to come down to Nudity from Anora and then go along up the beach and then up into the hills and then into Tukumara Bay. So much of that road has eroded away now. And that is the story of Nudity, erosion. So erosion, it was happening before our eyes. We thought, well, we'll just cut back our stock units, we'll do a little bit of fencing here and there, and we'll be fine. But of course, that is not what happened, and I'll invite you over the next couple of hours to have a look at what's happened here, because if you're at Tukumara Bay and you look south, you see that big headland that runs out into the sea, and there you can see the mawhai, and it's disconnecting. In fact, in my lifetime, and I'm 66 years old, it will be an island. So that was what always drew me. When I'd walk from Nudity all the way out there, I'd think, oh, we can't let this happen to you without trying to arrest that erosion. Of course, we were a sheep and beef farm, and in the day we got coerced or duped into giving our land to the Department of Māori Affairs to farm. Now, many of you would know that system, even though you talk about the Te Tumu Paeroa now. In our day, and particularly 50s, straight after the Second World War, everybody said, no, we'll put our land in with the Department of Māori Affairs. They know what they're doing, and they'll go farming for us. Oh boy. Next thing we found us with $300,000 worth of debt. You know, and we still had all of this going on and fencing. So my Uncle Jules, who was a visionary, he said to my mother one day, he said, oh, I think we've got to get rid of those people. And he was the director, so I don't think he's going to get rid of himself, you know, but she said to him at the time, well, you know, Jules, you know, what are we going to do? You're the director. And he said, oh, well, I'll write to the minister. And he duly did. And the next thing, of course, we find ourselves, you know, no stock because they took the stock off us and sold it. And we just had this land. That's all we had. And I think at the time he felt that this was going to defeat him. And what was our vision? And even though we tried very hard to dream up what we could do, tourism, get no stock, so we, you know, what we're going to do. In the end, we went down to the bank and we did the worst thing we could possibly do. We bought some stock. Cows, sheep. And still the land degraded. So I think when I know that story, and I was quite young, I wasn't really on the committee, even though we used to go to the AGMs and things like that, I used to think, well, what am I going to do when it comes to my time? Well, I guess I'm going to go down in the Nudity record as doing this, because although there's 7 people on our committee, we all know what happens in committees. It gets left up to 1 or 2, you know, and every AGM, they come along and they say to you, well, what have you done now, Nikki? So on and so forth. I wasn't actually in the chair, but it always seemed to fall to me and my poor old mum, Ingrid. Well, Ingrid was able to handle all the shareholders because she grew up with them. They were her aunties and uncles. It was a little bit more daunting for me, but I thought, well, if I could show them, they can't all walk out there, but if I could show them by way of photos that I used to take, that this is what was happening to their land, it was disconnecting, the mawhai would soon be gone out into the sea, that the stock were eroding the land, that they would give me the go-ahead to do something like 16 kilometres of fencing. I think at the time I didn't know it was going to be that much. I thought, oh, a few chain here and a few chain there and we'd be fine. Well, of course, that wasn't what happened. And when you start fencing, you have to keep going. You can't stop. And my manager, who's my cousin, Mike, he used to say to me, oh, you're my staff, you've got all my staff on fencing. You know, we've got to run a farm. Well, you know, I said to him at the time, I said, look, this is the most important thing we can do to our whenua so that our people and our children after us will have their ancestral land. So I found a very willing and helpful gentleman called Brian McKinlay. Brian had actually been working for, yes, he had, hadn't he? He'd been working there. And so he had a fair level of understanding of our land. And I wanted somebody who had empathy with me because I thought, well, Brian would understand we still have to pay the rates, we still have to pay the bank, and we still have to pay the wages. And not in that order, but all at once, isn't it, really? We've got to do everything. So Brian set about producing a plan for me that would look at how we could go into this emissions trading scheme. And I knew nothing about the emissions trading scheme, but with Brian's patient advice, and we had no money to pay him, we said, oh, we can't pay you. So he used to just come and have the odd holiday down on the beach with his little family, and he drew up this plan. And also, if you know anything about the system of plotting, we did have to spend some money, about $2,000 on the plotting service that was used to plot the areas that we were going to put into the emissions trading scheme. So I've given you a one-page handout. It took me all day to condense this from 5 pages down to 1, because I felt that I didn't want you all to go away thinking, oh, what was all that about that she was talking about? ETS, you know, that's nothing to do with me, so I'm not going to worry about it. But we should all worry about this. Not the ETS, but about our land. Because if we can't pay the rates on it, it'll be like Nudity, $300,000 worth of debt, some of it rates, some of it stock, and couldn't figure out how to pay it back. So I'll just draw your attention now to what we did. So we joined the emissions trading scheme. We started putting our heads around it in 2011, and we finally joined it in 2012 after we'd had 2 AGMs and committee changes, and everybody was on board. What they weren't quite clear about was how many hectares we were going to retire. I wasn't either. But when we started fencing, and you come up and have a look at these photos, you'll see that we started off thinking we were going to fence off and apply to the East Coast Forestry Grant Project for roughly about 200 hectares, and we ended up fencing 500. Now, if any of you can do the maths, the farming side of our committee was not very happy. However, I convinced them that we could make $1 million out of the scheme. Yes, well, along came Mr. Key's government, and he allowed his Minister of the Emissions Trading Scheme to go off and buy a whole lot of scammy units. Now, by that I mean they were bought from Eastern Europe, Russia, and they had no substance to them. They were not actually from that area at all. They were just simply made up by the government of the day, sold to our government, and that immediately drove the price down. I am jumping ahead here, but I'm trying to explain to you that that had a big impact on how we thought and acted. So we'd done all the fencing. We had a debt. Half of it was alleviated by the East Coast Forestry Grant, but if you know anything about that system, you know that you only get half after you've built the fence, of course. So we got half, and the bank, we still had to talk very nicely to our bank because our stock units didn't cover all of the debt. If you remember rightly, and you all know that we cannot put Māori land up for security. So we had a little bit of general land that we had it revalued, and that seemed to carry us along with the bank. I'm trying to be really very realistic here with you all, because if you come down this road that we went down, then these are some of the challenges you're going to meet. But look, we've done it, and I'm here because I said to Manukeri 2 years ago, we need to help our own landowners get into the emissions trading scheme. What I can say to you is that as the price rose, and I sat on the credits, because that's what you do, you don't go and sell them for $4, because once they're gone, they're gone. You do get another annual entitlement, but we were sitting on around about 40,000 units. So once we had plotted all these yellow squiggles, as you'll see them here, we then had the basis for going ahead on what they call post-89 system. So that's the criteria that we went in under. It's land that was once grazed and was now available behind the fence for nothing but native regeneration. Because remember, we're not growing pine trees here. We haven't got a pine tree in sight, except for, unfortunately, on our reserve over here. When you do head back down the coast, you'll see where we've been spraying the wildling pines that have been coming across. So our plan was simply to allow it to native regenerate, and Brian had convinced me that these other trees would blend in, and these are eucalypts. They're a really fast-growing tree, and they have. They've formed the basis of us being able to, really get our credits up. So now we had achieved two things. We had thought that we've gone some way to arresting the erosion, and that was sort of the most important tick with our shareholders, that we were going to stop the erosion or start to wind it back, because no stock on this land at all. So there it is, the fence that goes all the way up into the reserve. So it went from the foreshore all the way back up, and then we had what we thought was a sound business case to collect our entitlement of units. So that's continued. So we started selling in 2015, and if you can briefly read here that we had 500 hectares plus and 16 kilometres of fencing, that fortunately with Craigmore Forestry, which Brian McKinlay worked for, they helped us to bridge the gap, and eventually we sold at around about $9 a unit. So that was welcome news. The bank could see that these carbon units do actually produce money. They never quite believed me. In fact, I used to have to send the tax invoice to them, showing them that, yes, we got this 100,000, yes, it's going to pop into the bank very shortly. So I think for most banks, it's still a mystery. And I see you nodding there, Susie, because I think it still is a mystery to them. They just can't quite believe it or understand it themselves. So in summary, Nudity has grossed over the, since 2015 up to early this year, 590,000. We have direct costs of around about 25,000 between those 3 years. But of course, we endured just over $33,000 worth of bank interest. And that was mainly in that first 4 years when we didn't sell any units at all. So the bank just kept riding with us, with this really heavy debt. What I want to say to finish is that the conservative forecast for an NZU is likely to rise from where it is now, which is $25, up to around about $40 or $50 by 2022. Susie may have another, or Leo may have another view about it. There is a sort of a calculation for growth curve which is a limiting factor, and that is that with our native regeneration it slows. All right, so after 5 years, when we had the plots plotted again to see what the growth curve was of mainly Manuka Kānuka, they had slowed. But of course you've also got other seedlings coming up. So you've got the ground cover now looking, instead of like that, which is patchy, it now looks like a big forest and land where we used to put our cattle. I think my footnote at this time is that there is such a lot going on in the ETS space with government. Government is, in my opinion, complicating it. The latest review seems to have brought forward a lot more, some good things, but also some really difficult things to understand. And I think this afternoon I'll explain a little bit more, because I think really it's going to require, if Hikurangi Enterprises go with us on this, then for landowners coming in, they need to have a lot more understanding, a lot more education before you all leap into the unknown the way we did. Suffice to say that our shareholders, they really do like the money. They like the fact that I've paid off 2/3 of the debt. We had $800,000 worth of debt, and we're down to $300,000. The bank's coming to visit us next week, so I think we're in good books with the bank. And I think when I look back on it, we'd do it again. We would.
Because I understand that after harvesting, you will be required to repay all the carbon credits.
We chose, thank you, Ned. We chose never to harvest. So we are permanent forest cover. So we will never harvest. And I think the other part of our story is that we've got a beekeeper who loves it. He loves this ground growth that we're propagating. I think we did, at some stage, our shareholders were saying, well, look, how are we going to make any money if out of this? And I said, well, look, the land will only grow Manuka. And in fact, we've got a 200 hectare block of Kānuka. And underneath it is growing the next story. So we're carbon farming. That's how we see ourselves. We're not farming trees to to harvest. That's the subtle difference about it. I think what's new about this is that we're not growing pine trees to grow carbon. We're growing native, our own trees that the land wants to grow. We, So we started off reversion in 2012. So we've carried on until about we've only done some planting in last year. And we've planted into this block, these eucalypts that went in 2012 of 70 hectares, but there's also, I've started planting manuka in the last year into the same block, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, but not in this area. So the stock are all, we've got about 600 hectares of land for the stock. So it's all out of this block altogether and closer to back towards the beginning of Nudity. So that was a big change. That was a big change for Nudity. But we haven't reduced our stock numbers. In fact, we've increased them. Yeah, on a smaller block of land. And I think that's because, both our sheep and cattle, we've managed to bring the year date down. So instead of running them out to 13 years for stock for the cows and 5-6-year-olds for the sheep, we've got them down to under 5-year-olds for the sheep, breeding sheep, and under 8 years for the cattle. So it's been a big change for our farm, big change. Yes, that's a good question. So what we do is that we there are 2 market platforms that we can go on. We use Carbon Match, and the emitters will, if they need to buy credits, because they get to around about March, April, and they've got to do their returns back to government, so they're on the marketplace looking. Now, what we did do in 2014, I thought, right, the price was really unstable, so I thought, now, I'm going to go off and find us an emitter that will be able to negotiate and fix the price. So I did. So the emitter that we settled on, we'd already used them, we'd already sold to them before. So we had a fair idea about them. They were a small petrol company, fuel company called Gull. And so I sent them a photo of Nudity, and next thing I got this phone call saying, oh, we're really quite interested in buying your units. Anyway, to cut a long story short, after going backwards and forwards, we settled on a price of $18.40. And we made round about between $2 and $3 at that time on every unit. Well, that meant I could do some more fencing. Fencing seems to be our life. But when you run a farm of this geological formation and size, fencing is it. You're always fencing of some description. So, so that money certainly went. The bank was very happy, and so was our committee. And I know the shareholders were too, that we could have this contract with an emitter and, and get more money than what the marketplace was saying. But this year, I am going to sell back to Gull again, But I think at this stage, you can go on the marketplace and sell to whoever you like, really. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Yeah, I would. You would, because yeah. That's right. I mean, at the time, Gull was a New Zealand company. They're not now, But they've asked me will I sell to them again, but I haven't replied yet.
Tira, thank you, Nikki. Kia ora tātou, me era kōrero au.